Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on to the Life on Purpose podcast. I've spent the last few months kind of dedicated to bringing people like you on this show who can have who do have very useful information and methods and working with clients with kind of these chronic issues that we have a really hard time in our society, especially getting a handle on, kind of, especially in like the mainstream side. And your wheelhouse is skin, right? So as a clinical nutritionist,
Yes.
so I have not had somebody on this show talking about chronic skin conditions. So again, thank you so much for being here, and let's dive in.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it. And I think that you're right. There's actually not a whole lot of people that talk about skin, at least from the chronic skin rash perspective. There's a lot of folks, I think, who talk about acne, because acne is a lot of overlap with hormonal issues.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like eczema and psoriasis and rosacea and dandruff, a lot of times what you're told is, oh, it's just your gut.
Yeah.
It's just your gut. You have to take out these foods and heal your gut and it'll fix you.
Right.
And that's not what happens for most people. That's not it's usually not what happens. Unfortunately, there's a lot of disappointment. And I was in that boat of being incredibly disappointed by a lot of the holistic and integrative options that are written out on websites, because I had eczema and I tried so many of the holistic suggestions and salves and creams and all sorts of things that were natural, and nothing helped. And it's really frustrating because like this whole skin condition makes you feel super broken, because everything that works for other people is not working for you. And then what's worse is that you see people on Facebook groups who are like, oh my gosh, I tick out these 10 foods and my skin's like perfect now. And you should do that too.
Yeah.
And you try it and you feel worse. So this is what is so, it's such a shame that what I don't see in integrative medicine is this push forward to really understand these skin issues from a new perspective. I think just working on the diet, just doing eliminations, and just doing like the old wives' tales and herbs, and we do this salves and use this cream or this oil. I just don't think that's sufficient enough. And skin issues are more complex. So if it's not in your head, if anybody's listening and going, I feel like what I have going on is so much more complicated, and it actually is.
Yeah. And I think just with any chronic issue and chronic disease, it's an individual problem. So what got me sick with Hashimoto's and Graves' disease is not the same thing that got, the next person sick. And it's the same thing probably with chronic skin conditions. It's an individual digging into, what are your root causes? So kind of these blanket statements that we have in the holistic side, integrative side, and then even like dermatology, kind of the traditional side, don't work for everybody. So you're right. It's kind of, we need to take the individual and dig just a little bit deeper. But before we jump into that, I would love for people just to hear your story, how you got here, because I feel like so many of us, especially doing what we do, there's a reason for it. And it's usually because we've gone through it.
Well, as I kind of already let the cat out of the bag, I had eczema, specifically a form called dyshidrotic eczema that impacted my hands. And so dyshidrotic eczema is this really awful form of eczema. I don't know, they're all awful, but to me, it was awful because this is what I ended up with. And I don't know why. I don't know why I specifically got that form. I don't think anyone has a particular explanation for why some people get one form over the other. But you end up with these like clear bubbles under the skin. It usually impacts the palms and the feet, the bottoms of the feet. And the bubbles get to a point where they become really itchy, and then they will eventually burst, and everything gets incredibly inflamed. It burns. It is very uncomfortable. It drives you insane. And then eventually it kind of starts to dry out and heal over. And then the process starts again. Those bubbles reappear. And it's just this vicious cycle that happens. And it's not even like I've read online some practitioners like, oh, it's definitely parasites. I can tell you that not all my clients have parasites who've had dyshidrotic eczema. Some have, but not all have.
Yeah.
It's also not a month-long cycle either. So that makes it a little difficult to just right out the gate blame parasites. For a lot of folks who struggle, at least with this form of eczema, like definitely there's a strong, usually component of struggling to, from a nutritional perspective, detoxify things, like essentially repackage them appropriately so you can get them shuttled out of the body.
Right.
We can talk more about that too,
Yeah.
but there always usually are some level of gut issues, not 100% of cases, but a lot of times there can be. Like when this happened to me, I was in the middle of grad school. It was an incredibly, incredibly stressful time. And I wasn't eating great. I wasn't sleeping great. I was running a business full time and I was trying to go to school full time.
Yeah.
And it was a lot. So stress certainly plays a factor. Stress can be an onset trigger. Many different things can be. And for me, that was really the trigger. And it took me a while to figure things out. I became very, very depressed. I wanted to quit school because it got to the point where, you think like, okay, a little rash, but it's not a little rash. With time, my rash got worse and worse. It started to spread up the sides of my fingers and then down my palms. And then it started to mess up my nails. And it became just this awful cycle that would keep me up at night itching. I would wake up sometimes and I had been itching my hands unknowingly in the middle of the night. And like I had clawed the skin away.
Gosh.
I mean, it's just awful. And so, I didn't want to keep doing steroids. I mean, that was basically all that was pretty much offered to me, that and Vaseline. I'm like, yeah, Vaseline on my hands. Like, I don't know about the practicality of that, aside from whether I want to use Vaseline or not. And, I needed to try to get to the bottom of it because the one thing that was probably the worst thing was when I would go to shake somebody's hand and they would try to kind of bail out of that handshake because they saw how inflamed my hands were. And as much as I understand the fear that comes in looking at somebody who has this really broken skin and you're wondering like, oh my gosh, what do they have? What are they infected with? It still hurts when people don't want to touch you because they think that you're going to infect them with something.
And I oftentimes think that sometimes these more outward conditions that you can see, because most of these like autoimmune issues and chronic issues, you can't see unless, unless there's hair loss or, other things that are very apparent. But I imagine that that's a little isolating and kind of adds just a little bit extra stress on top of an already stressful, okay, what is going on? Why is this happening to me? Let's get to the bottom of it issue.
It is. And, it's not just eczema. I have psoriasis clients who they don't want to even show they've got different plaques all over their skin. Their legs are really, so now that it's becoming summertime, there's this fear and concern of wearing even just shorts or sandals. Sometimes it's actual functional issues. Like if you have rashes around your feet or your ankles, that can actually hurt to wear sandals. Sometimes it's really painful. Some people end up with cracks and really deep crevices and breaks in the skin on the bottoms of their feet. So it's painful to walk. You can have all different issues throughout the groin that can make it just painful to move or to sit. And with my hands, like the palms of my hands, but even for the back, I mean, everyone's washing their hands more. So that is also problematic. But what about people who have active rashes who cannot constantly put on or like use hand sanitizer? Like some stores require you to use hand sanitizer or to wash your hands constantly if you're concerned and you don't want to get sick. What about just being able to go to the gym? Like I had to stop working out because I couldn't wash my hands. Like water, not soap. And soap did, but just the water burned so badly. It was torturous. I had to like cut back on how often I could take a shower and even wash my hair because gloves don't keep water out. Let me just tell you that.
So you tried it all.
You don't realize how many, or even just to like grab a doorknob and turn it when your skin is so delicate that it will break just from bending your fingers, and
Mm,
then having to, turn a knob, that can be painful. So you don't recognize and realize how often we take for granted just basic
yeah.
things. And for people with skin issues where they can't cover it up, where it's on your face, where it impacts your hands, where it impacts areas that, in the summertime, you normally would be visible and you just want to hide. Absolutely. Like
Yeah.
I was like, maybe I guess I'm just going to become a recluse in my house and not see people anymore. So yeah, I can really relate. And that was why I decided to actually do this, because I realized once I got my skin into a much better state where I put the eczema into remission, and seeing all the photos and cries for help online, I just was like, I can't like walk away from this and be like,
You
well, I'm
can't
fine.
yeah, you
Right.
can't not do something with that. So
Right.
let me ask you, what were you doing before? What was your career path before?
Before that, I was a health coach, actually. So I've been in
Okay.
this space for a really
Okay.
long time, since 2009. So my diet was really healthy. I was gluten,
Yeah.
dairy, and egg free for 6 years before this even happened. So when people are like,
Wow.
did you eliminate? I'm like, please stop with the eliminations. Like, I already eat an organic diet. I already do all the things.
Yeah.
I already use like the cleanest cleaning
Yeah.
products. I already do all those things, and I got eczema. So stop assuming that every single person, like that the case is due to the standard common triggers that we tend to
Yeah.
blame chronic illness on. That's where skin conditions get much more complicated, because for those that don't improve by simply swapping out your laundry detergent and
Mhm.
your shampoo and your makeup, that's where we start to realize that there's so many other fast factors going on that we really need to dig into.
Right. So let's get to that then. Given that you were already doing all of these other things before the eczema showed up, what was it for you that you found was kind of either your root cause or your triggers? What is it that was like the thing?
So for me, I don't know. And I'm being
Still don't know.
entirely honest,
Yeah.
because to be fair, I didn't have access to testing.
Yeah.
I was still in grad school, so I didn't know all the answers. So what
Yeah.
I did was I just like concocted this crazy like supplement regimen that I would
Uh-huh.
never give anyone now. And I don't even remember all the different pieces to it, but I know I was
Yeah.
taking a lot of different stuff. And eventually after 6 months, it took 6 months
Yeah.
to start to see minor improvements in the flare cycle.
Yeah.
So 6 months. So, it's a very slow journey. It is, if you choose to not go the medication route. And to be fair, there are pros and cons to everything you choose to do. And there are some people like myself who choose to incorporate in some amount of medication in the
Mhm.
process to maintain your sanity. Like, you should never be shamed because you have to utilize some medication, whether it's some topical steroid or whatever, in order to maintain like just to be functional. And
Well, and
there's a lot of shaming in the skin world for
and I
choosing to
think
use meds.
beyond too.
True.
And I think it's really important. That's a very important point that you made, because, you can go either hardcore one way, hardcore the other, when really the answer is kind of in the middle sometimes. If
Mhm.
you say, I absolutely do not want pharmaceuticals at all, or only pharmaceuticals, and I don't want to even change my diet or my lifestyle or my stress, you're kind of missing the point. And I think it's my dream world to have this more integrative approach anyway, to say, listen, there's these tools on this side and there's these tools on this side, and how can we mesh them together for these chronic conditions? And I think we're getting there. I think the word is out that, these approaches are working a lot more than either hardcore one way, hardcore the other. Um, so yeah, you're right. There is a lot of this kind of shaming. Well, if you take medication, then you failed, or, whatever it is. But you're absolutely right. And I think that's an important point. Um, so when you were, I guess let's segue into testing then, because, you said at first you didn't have access to this testing. And I think a lot of the times we can get really caught up in some of the testing and kind of spend a lot of money for answers that may or may not be in some of these tests. So how do you approach testing with your clients?
So testing is pretty straightforward and simple because I hate to waste money
Yeah.
and I hate to waste time. I think doing all the tests, unless you are incredibly, incredibly, incredibly ill and non-functional,
Yeah.
is usually overkill for most cases. Like if your practitioner needs to test if you have leaky gut, they're not a good practitioner. I'm going to tell you that right now. If you can't tell just from symptomology
Right.
that they likely have a leaky gut, and what difference does it make if you have a leaky gut or not? Does it change the protocol? No. So that's always the question to ask.
Yeah.
What would this change? If I spend the money on this testing, how does this change your protocol? If it doesn't, then is it really necessary? Because
Right.
all of the things that you do outside of the insurance realm are expensive.
Yeah.
And they may be more affordable for some people based on, how much money and how much income they make and whatnot. But in order to make this more accessible for people as a whole, we have to start thinking about being more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I think this is the first piece of it, is identifying where we need to dig. So I'll say this before I preface with what testing I prefer, because a lot of people want to cast a net because they don't really understand what's going on. But there are, at least from my experience, and maybe this is in other areas, but I really focus mostly on skin. So I consider there to be 16 root causes, and you have some cluster of 3 to 5, maybe 6. And that makes up this unique picture of why you tried the elimination diet that Susie tried and she got better, but you didn't. And it explains a lot of the reasons as to why it's so frustrating for so many people who see other people getting better doing X, Y, and Z, and they actually don't get better or get worse.
Yeah.
And so with that, I'll go through these very quickly.
Yeah.
You have microbiome imbalance issues that can impact the skin, the gut. You can also have hidden infections included in this that could be like parasites. If you have them, don't always end up in the gut. Some move, some end up elsewhere in your body. Your foot is actually the number one entry point to parasitic infections, not your gut. You could also have, stealth infections, other issues in the body like Lyme disease and whatnot. You can also have root canals and issues in your mouth microbiome that then impact everything else. So again, microbiome issues throughout the body.
Yeah.
Gut dysfunction, diet and food reactions are actually just one piece of the 16. Nutrient deficiencies, which are pretty common, liver detoxification challenges. I'm not saying do a detox, by the way. This is more about, does it have the supplies to be able to, and nutrients essentially, to be able to do the repackaging in phase 1 and phase 2 detox. There's also trauma, which I know our colleague Justin Janoska talks a lot about, unmanaged stress, genetic implications, because there is a gene specifically called filaggrin that can impact whether your skin is considered kind of leaky and you have this inability to maintain the moisture barrier. Then you have thyroid dysfunction, other hormonal imbalances like estrogen dominance or insulin resistance, autoimmunity, drug reactions, mitochondrial dysfunction, heavy metals, environmental toxins, and also environmental allergies like pollen, chemical, dander, etc. So you have some cluster of those. And if you cannot identify it, if you just say, okay, what tests? That's not really helpful, because at the end of the day, what's going on will help me determine what specific test you need. Like, not everybody should be looking for what their serum IgE level is, because for somebody who has a histamine overload picture, that's going to be really helpful. For everybody else, who cares? It doesn't matter. So my preference is, can we get blood work, hopefully supported by your doctor, that is covered under your insurance? Right. And pretty standard stuff. There's nothing like crazy or necessarily wild about what I'm asking for. And then with that, I can usually like to combine that with a really good comprehensive stool test, something like a GI map. There's also now a new stool test called the GI 360. I've yet to see that in my practice, but I've been hearing about that and have been trying to look into that stool test, and then the GI effects. So something that's an actual clinical lab not something, not Viome. Don't waste your money. If anybody is listening, and I hope, and I've started to realize like I should be careful because I'm afraid that people from Viome are going to like come after me, but
They're
like
going to hear about
seriously,
this.
stop spending money with Viome. It's a waste of money. Like, who cares what percentage of Clostridia you have? What does that mean in the grand scheme of things? I don't know. That is not anything that any clinician has ever taught. It doesn't mean anything. It's a nice snapshot. You get this 52-page report that like, you're like, oh my gosh, so much data to go through, so much data with nothing to do with it. Like you can't do anything. You can't build a protocol. You can't do anything. So save your money and spend that money on a stool test that's actually going to have more clinical significance that you can actually build a protocol off of.
Okay, so these ones that you recommend, what is the difference that you're going to see? What does it tell you in kind of these GI map tests versus kind of a more Viome test?
So a Viome test is a consumer lab. That's why it's marketed to everybody on Facebook and Instagram.
Yeah.
The other labs can't do that. They're not allowed to. And the other thing too is those tests come with just basically, for the most part, a report of the findings. They can't advise you on dietary changes to make, supplements to take, or anything like that because they're not allowed to do that. The Viome, on the other hand, cannot tell you if you have infections and all sorts of unfriendly bugs going, like hanging out in the system. They're not allowed to tell you that because then they're going to provide you with a report and tell you what's wrong. And then that would be technically, that veers into like the diagnosing, and then they are providing you a treatment plan. You're not allowed to do that.
So these more GI mapping can create a report that has a bigger picture of kind of these big culprits.
Right. So it's going to tell you if you have parasitic, bacterial, or viral pathogens. It looks at your essentially like the breakdown of normal commensals, so the healthy bacteria that you should have. It looks for H. pylori. It looks at different bacterial strains that for some people can trigger autoimmunity. They can also be opportunistic, so they can cause a ton of problems and explain certain issues that are going on with somebody's skin and other health concerns. It also looks at fungal organisms, though that sometimes can be hit or miss. And it'll look at other viruses, and then it'll look for some other parasites, worms, and protozoa. And then you'll get a gut function section that'll look at fat absorption. Was there hidden blood in the stool? What it was your calprotectin marker, which is a marker used in gastroenterology. So you're looking at, your secretory IgA response. So can your body mount an immune response in your GI tract? Yeah. There's a lot of very important markers that are used in gastroenterology to help differentiate between IBS and IBD and really so there have been cases where a client will have a stool test and I'm like, oh, you have an infection with cryptosporidium and some other things. I need you to go back to your doctor because that, I think, you'd be better off getting treatment for that. And then we can start digging into other things. There's also been times where I'm like, you know what? I'm not sure if there's an IBD picture here, but I'm really concerned with these markers. So I want you to go back to either your family doctor or a GI doctor. You're going to repeat a local stool test. They're not as sensitive, but at least you'll have local markers for whatever is going on. And that way we can identify and question, is there a possible IBD picture going on here? So that's not what Viome is going to tell you. I can't do anything with that data. Like nothing. It's like getting like a Polaroid of your gut. Like that's cute. You spend a lot of money on it, but there's nothing you can do with it.
No info.
So again, if you're going to focus on something, focus on a comprehensive stool test, but then you have to get help with it. I really try to make this clear for people. Like these are not stool tests you can Google, even if you get I even have their report somewhere here. Sometimes I'll look certain things up, but if you don't work with a practitioner who actually understands how to read it and all the different bacteria and somebody like with skin, a lot of times things that, so I I review and I'm much more aggressive, I should say, with the stool test results than other practitioners, because most of them read them for gut problems. And gut problems, you can let certain things go that with skin issues you cannot, but it's just from clinical experience and knowing certain bacteria or histamine producers, and that can cause this, and based on the clinical picture. But also the clinical picture in your history is so important. It's not just what's going on now. I like to ask questions all the way back to childhood to really unlock that history, the historical picture that can help me identify, like, I know the test doesn't say that, or excuse me, the test says that you don't have any fungal organisms here, but based on your history and these factors, I don't actually believe this section. I do think you have fungal overgrowth, and I'm going to use my clinical wisdom to override what this test says, because they're not perfect. They're not 100%. So that's where it's really crucial. Like, if you're going to invest in this, just understand that there is that piece where you're going to need help to understand what the test says, and then you're going to need help to put that action into place, because you can react with skin issues. And I would hate for anybody to like start taking stuff and not realize that they can react, or could make their skin issues worse, and they become even more non-functional than they already are.
Right. And then you feel like you've kind of failed. Like, what else can I do? Where else can I go? What's going to help me? And kind of go through that process of just throwing your hands up and giving up, or like you said, becoming a recluse, whatever. But so how do you get people to understand? Because I was sitting here listening and thinking, okay, people are going to be who have not taken this route, who do not know that this route is an option for them. What does my stool test have to do with my skin? How does this manifest? So how do these dysfunctions, what are some of the common, kind of root causes that will exacerbate skin issues, create skin issues?
Well, I mean, any of the 16 that I listed, I think the thing to understand, and this is how I break it down, is that if you look at the biologic drugs that are used to manage or stop like whether it's psoriasis or eczema, like eczema right now, the big one is Dupixent. And then with psoriasis, there's actually a lot for psoriasis right now. There's like Humira, Enbrel, Skyrizi, I don't know, there's a bunch. But what they all do is they block an inflammation pathway that generates symptoms.
So basically just
it's not on
the problem.
Well, yes and no. Okay. So it's shutting off what is essentially a check engine light of your car, telling you that there's a problem. And that's how we know that the inflammation, and if you listen to any of even just the conventional dermatologists that I have interviewed on the Healthy Skin Show, at some point in most interviews, they will acknowledge that all of these skin issues are driven by inflammation. The mistake is assuming that it's just in the area that you can see the inflammation.
Right.
Because Dupixent is a shot. How does the shot, if you put a shot, like let's just say in your hip, how's that going to impact the skin on your forearm? Like, it's not like you rubbed it on your forearm. You didn't. So it has to work its way internally. And so what it's doing is it's shutting off an inflammation pathway that generates symptoms. And so if that's the case, then the question is, what is actually generating the inflammation internally? Now, listen, I want to be very clear. For some people, it is your prerogative to choose whether you want to do medication or not. And I think this is sort of an aside to that whole like medication shaming piece, because not everybody's actually ready. Not everybody is capable of going through this whole process, and they just want relief and they want to go back to their normal life. And you know what? You do you, because everyone reaches the right path for themselves at the right point in time.
Right.
And whether you start in one spot doesn't mean that you can never go down another pathway. I've had clients that have spent a long time going the natural route, and they hit a breaking point where I literally am the one being like, are you sure you don't want to try, like, maybe even give a biologic a try for a while, because you're just suffering so much. And there's a lot of issues here. There have been times where I've had to really coach clients around and explain to them after they see the stool test. I'm like, listen, I understand you want to do this naturally, But given the state of overgrowth, given the state of what all of the high levels of these really unfriendly bacteria, and you've got like blasto and all this stuff, are you sure that an antibiotic and maybe an antiparasitic medication, at least because of how the degree of suffering that you're going through right now, might not get you to a better point where then we could continue on with this? So I think it's about leaving all the options on the table and being willing to say what my body needs right now is of the utmost importance. What I want is not necessarily what it needs. And so with skin issues, that's why I found that looking at the gut can be really important, that microbiome. So for example, there is research that shows us that someone with psoriasis, the tendency is, and especially with psoriatic arthritis, that their microbiome looks a lot like a person who has inflammatory bowel disease. In eczema, we see this dysbiosis, this trend of, some of you may understand, oh yeah, staph infections are always a risk with eczema on the skin. Well, there is this tendency to find Staph aureus in the GI tract. And so inflammation someplace else can cause a ton of problems everywhere. It could be your joints, it could be headaches, it could be, you're really sensitive to environmental pollen. Like you find that you're like all of a sudden really bothered by the allergy season this year. You become incredibly reactive to like everything. I mean, I've even worked with some cases of chronic hives or urticaria where they're so sensitive. If they sweat, if they get hot, if they wear, like some women have trouble even wearing like pants or a bra, because just the pressure alone will cause hives to bust out. So like if they live in Florida, just walking outside to walk their dog is a huge problem. And so the answer, like the conventional thing is like, I don't know, arms up in the air. We're really not sure. Maybe you could try an antihistamine. Maybe we could try Xolair. Maybe we could try, we really don't know. But there's also research to show that there's a high incidence of parasitic infections that can be connected with chronic urticaria. I've had clients where their total IgE, so it's a blood marker, and it's a regular marker you can get through your doctor, is through the roof, like 5,000 through the roof. They are not around any of their allergens. Like a lot of times it'll be like food allergies and whatnot. They're not around any. So why is it still so high? Why is it so high if you're not around the triggering allergy? Just because you have an allergy doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be high. And so what can drive your total IgE up are things that destabilize mast cells, that dump histamine, for example, into your system and can drive you crazy. And so whether that shows up as eczema, it can show up as hives, it can show up as allergies and asthma. That can be things like H. pylori. So H. pylori infections in your stomach can destabilize mast cells and increase histamine release. There are certain bacteria in the GI tract, so it's not normal to have these. But certain bacteria like Morganella specifically and certain Klebsiella species actually produce histamine. So you could like have a histamine production factory inside of you that you can't like close the doors and windows on and use an air filter. It's not going to help because it's internal. You're literally swimming in histamine production. And then also too, there's a lot of research. My associate and I have been like really digging into this of how certain parasitic infections can drive the total IgE higher as well. So certain parasites also, like the Entomoeba histolytica, produce histamines. There's a lot of cases of blasto that, is not something that they commonly test for, because the assumption is that there's just, we're in a clean country. We live in the United States or in Canada or in Europe, and there's nothing here. And that's actually not true. Arkansas is like the capital for hookworm infections. And you can easily Google that and find that information out. So no, it is very possible that you could pick up a parasitic infection or anything else from your environment. H. pylori is the #1 most common infection in the world, with 50 to 60% of the population being infected. and 30% of them have no symptoms. So that's why I look there, because I'm looking for internal inflammatory issues that can really create a storm that your body can no longer contain.
And that's how it manifests outwardly. So
exactly.
we have this tendency to, and it's a billion-dollar industry, kind of this skin industry, and not even with just like anti-aging and, all of that, but creams and I see this, I have 3 kids, and I see this kind of in my mom circles of, hey, my kid has eczema. What cream can I do instead of, and I'm always just back there like, okay, do I want to show my crazy? Do I, let's look inward, like what else is going on kind of stuff. But having this tendency of thinking that it's just external, but getting people to think about these other pieces. So where do you go from there? Okay, so you've got this picture, you've done all the digging, you've gone back in their history, you have these tests, based on the history on where you went. Now what?
Well, now it's creating a plan.
Yeah.
Creating a plan. So making dietary changes that are sensible, not doing something super, super crazy unless it is absolutely warranted. Like a low histamine diet is really hard to follow. It is a soul crushing diet. I'm going to be honest. So
have you tried
not appropriate.
Have you done that?
No, why would I want to try that? It's awful. Like no person wants to.
So histamine was never one of your issues.
No, no, I've never had a histamine issue. I've almost never have to take antihistamine. So I don't have that piece, but like, and I'm just being very honest and straight. I'm not making fun or laughing at any single person. I have extreme empathy, by the way. If you're doing a low histamine diet, understand, I know how hard it is because you can't, on the most extreme version, you can't even have leftovers. So it is really, really hard. So you want to find the appropriate dietary changes that are going to yield the biggest benefit without drastically altering your life. I mean, I'll be honest, if you're eating a lot of junk food, you should try to make some, simple changes. Like don't pay somebody an exorbitant amount of money to tell you like you should stop eating McDonald's. That's pretty much an obvious step.
Right.
Like change your diet, start eating more real food. And if you want to have the occasional dessert or treat or whatever, I'm not going to begrudge you that. I like for folks to not end up with an eating disorder, which is very, very common, unfortunately, in chronic skin issues.
And I was actually going to get there because I feel like so much that those of us that go down this route, of, the more holistic side can oftentimes get really hung up and have this food fear. You create this fear around food. If I consume this, how is it going to make me feel? And if you do have a reaction, is it the reaction from the food or is it a reaction from the fear of the food? So I personally never had that issue, but I have spoken to women over the last few years that they're terrified. They're terrified of food at this point.
They're terrified. It's also not just the fear. It's also, you don't understand because we're not literally inside the GI tract. We don't know what happens to the food once it goes down I call it when it gets into the digestive tube, we don't know what happens.
Yeah.
So a reaction, we may mistake it as being, well, this food is bad for me, but in reality, it could be a sign. Like, for example, I had a client yesterday who told me that when she eats meat, just meat in general, not fish, but meat, like beef and chicken and pork, she would feel very bloated and just not well, sluggish and whatnot, and just felt very puffy overall. And given her historical picture and the fact that her fiance acknowledged that he has heartburn and has indigestion quite frequently, I was like, I know your stool test says you don't have H. pylori, but I actually think you do. And I think you both do, because that's a good tip for everybody here. If you have H. pylori and you have a partner, they likely have it too, because it's very infectious and it is transferred via saliva. So, that's where it's important to pull these pieces together. So she was assuming it was the food. And I'm like, if you have H. pylori, you're not able to break meat down well. And then that further explains why some of her blood markers looked the way that they did, why she was struggling with, I think B12 was one of them. So B12 is actually linked, it's biochemically bonded to amino acids in food. And so you need that stomach acid to break those bonds. And so you start losing nutrients when you don't have sufficient stomach acid due to H. pylori. And that causes a car accident all the way down your digestive tract, unfortunately. Right. So you blame the meat, but it wasn't actually the meat's fault. It's something else going on. And so I say, let's stop saying that things are good or bad. There's no good or bad foods. It's just based on how you feel. If you're getting a reaction, let's say why. Why am I getting a reaction? If going plant-based made you feel better, why? Right. If going carnivore made you feel better, why? So those are always the really important questions that I think we're not encouraged to ask because it's not convenient and it doesn't sell diet books. So smart diet changes are important that help you stay balanced and that avoid you becoming fearful of food. The second piece to this too is supporting, and this is actually equally important. You really need to support that specifically phase 2 liver detoxification. You don't do that by doing a liver detox. You do it by adding in nutrients that those specific pathways require in order to repackage toxins. And with skin issues, those liver pathways tend to be really overwhelmed. And so that's crucial to do the entire time. And then also to making sure to address gut function. So do you have diarrhea? Are you constipated? Getting things moving at least appropriately. You need to be pooping 1 to 3 times a day of a healthy stool. If you're not, you can't do a quote unquote kill protocol that we see all over Instagram these days. Right. If you're backed up, like that's not going to happen because that's just sitting in you and it's going to make you feel worse. Right. So we want to optimize all of this before we then start addressing what's going on in the microbiome. And then the choice of how to do that is really up to you. Some people just totally want to do the natural route. Some people have a lot of allergies. They can't. They're really sensitive to a lot of different botanicals, especially like, for example, the ragweed family, folks that have ragweed allergies. You can't do milk thistle. You can't do dandelion root. You can't do burdock. You also can't do stevia. So you're limited. You start ticking off. And some people have allergies to, gosh, I have clients that are allergic to garlic, or allergic to lavender, allergic to nuts. They can't do a lot of these different antimicrobials. And that's where we do have to reach for medication and ask for the support from a doctor. And then going through the process of also supporting the skin from the outside in, because that is equally important. This is really a 2-pronged approach. It's not just 100% internal. Right. And so figuring out what is an appropriate, having some different oils and salves that can be helpful. For example, I don't recommend coconut oil, especially if you have eczema. It's a real hard pass. There's a lot more coconut allergies now that coconut flour, coconut oil, coconut out the wazoo is used in so many recipes, especially in the paleo and autoimmune world. A lot of people are finding that they're actually allergic to coconut, and applying it to their skin is eliciting a reaction. And they think it's what they're eating and they're taking out more and more, but they're putting coconut oil in their skin. So aside from the whole issue with acne for the face, is please stop putting anything with coconut on your face. For everyone listening, it's just not good. You're going to get acne. But it's also, coconut oil in and of itself is so highly antimicrobial that it causes more dysbiosis. It's also too thick to be absorbed from just like the size of the fat molecules themselves. They're too large to be absorbed. So it sits on the skin and creates this occlusive barrier that your skin can't breathe. So it's not a great option. And so look at some other plant options that might be worthwhile. So there are also animal options like tallow and emu oil. Some people love jojoba, though it's very light. It's very similar to our sebum. Some people love avocado oil. So look around and see what you can find, and test things out. Those are single ingredients. So if you know that your skin doesn't like them, then you know it's that.
So that the topicals are just for comfort purposes as you're healing internally, or what do these actually do for you on
Well, they're
the
helping to nourish,
external?
they are helping to actually nourish the skin barrier. I mean, the thing is, you have to keep in mind that this is a barrier.
Yeah.
The skin itself is a barrier just as much as your gut.
Yeah.
And so when this becomes compromised, we can't maintain moisture. And so it is crucial to do whatever you can to try to support the skin. You can't just like forget it and say, oh, it's only internal. It's not.
Yeah.
There's two factors going on
It's
here.
obviously manifested outward.
Right. And
Yeah.
so a couple other things people can try. There's a product, I have no relation to it. It's called Indigo Calm Balm. It does have probiotics in it. And I've found for some clients, it's really helpful. There's also some great research on an herb called Indigo Naturalis, and it's added sometimes, it's like a purple color, and it's added to creams and balms. It can be really helpful for people with psoriasis.
Okay.
Some people have found ozonated oils to actually be helpful, sometimes using it on the scalp. Sometimes CBD oil used topically can be helpful. Just make sure there's no essential oils, especially menthols, added to it, because that could burn.
Right.
Do not put essential oils on broken skin. You will likely end up sensitized to them with an allergy that will not go away. So I know there's a lot of DIYers out there, and they're like, oh, mix this oil and put it in a carrier oil and all that jazz. But you got to be really careful when you have broken skin, because again, it's a broken barrier.
Right.
And that's problematic. And then also zinc. So some nutrients can actually be absorbed through the skin. Vitamin D can topically, but that will actually impact your nutrient stores. So know if you do end up using vitamin D from a topical product, just know that if you're also supplementing, they're all going to add up to whatever is going on internally.
So it'd be important to know your vitamin D level going into using a topical on top of supplementation.
For vitamin D.
Yeah.
For zinc, no. Zinc stays in the epidermis, so it doesn't go any deeper, and it does not impact the stores of zinc in the body. So
that wouldn't be accumulating like the
that wouldn't be, it is accumulating in the skin, which is one of the storage sites for zinc. So it's sort of like a shortcut route to get it into the skin. Whereas when you take it orally, it's going to go wherever is prioritized first and most needed. And so some people will find, and a lot of clients have found too, that zinc topically can be really helpful. Again, I'm not suggesting you put any of this on broken like wounds or anything like that. But as long as you don't have an allergy to zinc, it can be used on the face. It can be used on different areas of the body. It can be feel very soothing. It can also reduce the amount of itchiness that you have, because zinc in and of itself does help stabilize mast cells, and it can improve the ability of the skin to hold moisture in. And it's, it's one of the ingredients that we use in one of my Quell products as well, because it's just like, it's so helpful.
Right. So yeah, and I think, like you said before, that's really important to have something to soothe what's happening outwardly, so that you have the energy to kind of go forward with the protocols that you're doing kind of internally too. And like you said, whether that's, medication short-term or long-term or whatever, route you choose to go, but just having kind of that mental energy to keep going and be on that path to healing, and then eventually getting there. So as we kind of wrap up, because this has all been very great information, I would love to hear from you one of like your most awesome kind of turnaround clients, like one you're just like, oh my gosh, this is my success story. Who kind of, because people like you who work with people who have these skin conditions that affect their lives, I mean, outwardly, inwardly, all of it. To be able to change somebody's life like that, I'm sure is really rewarding.
It is. And it's so cool to get to that last call where they're like, I can't believe looking at my photos that this is where I am. And it's really fun. And look, am I going to say 100% of cases, everybody gets better? No. I mean, there's a lot of complication, and sometimes there's other things going on. And everyone's journey is a different period of time.
Yeah.
And I would say err on the side of assuming you probably have a year's worth of work,
Yeah.
not 2 months worth of work. So you can kind of get your head in the right place to stay that course. Gosh, so many different stories that are positive. I will say recently, one win was that a client had dyshidrotic eczema on her palms. And she tried a lot of different things. She's been working on things over the years. She's super, super sensitive to a lot of foods. She'd done a lot of food sensitivity testing and removed a lot, and even just was very reactive to things.
Yeah.
And so we did identify H. pylori. She had a blasto infection. She had a bunch of unfriendly bacteria. We've been working through that. And then when we added in some immunoglobulins, and I actually talk about this on the Healthy Skin Show in a recent episode, she has been able not only to keep her hands clear, but she's been able to start reintroducing foods that she never thought she would be able to before.
Wow.
And she's not reacting to them or flaring at all. Like she's started with ice cream. So
Hey,
ice
that'd be the
cream,
one I would start with.
nuts. She told me today, nuts, seeds. She was able, oh goodness, there was a few other things that she was able to start adding in that she didn't think she was going to be able to tolerate. And she really did need the immunoglobulin support to help. And she was also finding that it was helpful with her allergies as well. And so using different tools can be helpful. And for her, that's a huge win. She's not 100% at the end of the road. We're still working on things, but to like be able to show her clear hands in my group, I do a group program. She was so excited, and and this isn't like a fluke. She's been like this for over a month now, and it's just exciting to see her progress. So things like that, where I even have stuff on my Instagram account of people where they show their legs before and after being completely clear. It is possible. It just takes time.
Yeah.
And that is the one piece with skin issues that I think does not get underscored enough. It takes time. It is the scenic route. And listen, if it's not for you, if you choose to go the biologic route, I totally understand. I completely understand. And by the way, you can, even if you're on a biologic, you can still do this work. You just have to use lab tests to help us gauge if it's working. But there are options out there. And I really love what I do. I love the clients that I support, and I want to change the way that we address this, not just in conventional medicine, but even in functional medicine. I don't think functional medicine does skin issues all that well either. Like I said, they usually just approach them like they're gut cases, and they're not. They're different. So that was why I started the Healthy Skin Show. It's why I've got like close to 200 episodes, and I'm still going. I got more to say, and I just want to keep filling the knowledge gap and creating this body of work that will. I don't want to leave these people behind. Like when I see the photos online, I'm like, okay, I still have more work to do. I still have more work, because I know that we need to change the way that we're thinking about this. It's not just about eliminating foods. It's not just about drug choices and changing your detergent. There's so many other factors. And
kind of the bigger picture, right? The bigger picture of what's going on.
And I'm in it for the long haul.
Yeah, so. You're kind of like a detective.
I say a co-pilot. I like to be like a co-pilot
there you go.
Help support my clients, because at the end of the day, I'm not the boss of them.
Right.
We're in it together. They're tapping into my expertise, my knowledge, my resources and whatnot. And I'm relying on them to do the work, to share with me important details, and to communicate. And that's really important. That's
a very important reminder for people too, is that you have to be willing to do the work. They can take all the expertise you have, all the testing, all the results you have, but if you're not willing to do that work and be kind of in it and be your own advocate, it's difficult to get to the end of that road and have a good result. So you are a wealth of information. I would love to share with everybody where they can find you, kind of where you hang out the most, where they can find the most information. Yeah. So where are you hanging out the most these days?
Well, there's 3 spots,
Okay.
kind of 2, but the Healthy Skin Show, I have a new episode every single week.
Perfect.
And you can find that at healthyskinshow.com.
Okay.
And then I would say the next best spot to find me would be on Instagram, because I do share about client cases and different things that are going on and whatnot. Those would be the best things. I do have a newsletter, and that keeps people up to date, but that's if you want to join that. I would say the Healthy Skin Show and Instagram are probably like great places to start to get to know me and more about what I do.
Awesome. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for sharing all of your insight and expertise. And everybody, go visit all the sites that she just mentioned. And I'm so grateful for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.